In 1888, two siblings sat for what should have been an ordinary photograph. William and Eleanor Milton, dressed in their Sunday best, posed in a small photography studio while their parents watched from behind the camera. For over a century, this picture sat forgotten in an archive, just another relic from the past. But when a modern historian used digital technology to enhance the image, she discovered something hiding in the background that was never meant to be seen. What she found wasn't just strange, it was evidence of a tragedy that someone had desperately tried to cover up. This discovery would reveal that the photograph wasn't a cherished family memory. It was something much darker. Dr. Alara Vance had spent 15 years restoring damaged historical photographs. She worked alone in her lab, surrounded by scanners and monitors, bringing faded memories back to life. Most days were routine. She'd receive boxes of old photos from museums and historical societies, scan them at high resolution, and carefully repair the damage that time had caused. But the day she received the Milton collection from a small town's historical society, everything changed. The collection came from Millbrook, a forgotten town in New England that had barely survived into the 20th century. Most of the photos were typical for the era. There were stiff family portraits, images of the town's main street, and pictures of local celebrations. But one photograph stood out immediately. It showed two children, a boy who looked about 10 years old and a girl who appeared to be 7. The boy, William, stood tall with his hand on his sister Eleanor's shoulder. She sat in an ornate chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Neither child smiled, which was normal for photographs of that time. Long exposure times made it impossible to hold a smile without it looking unnatural. The photograph had been taken in a professional studio. Behind the children was a painted backdrop showing a peaceful forest scene with tall trees and a winding path. The edges of the photo were yellowed and slightly torn, but the image itself was remarkably clear. As Alara began the scanning process, she noticed how well preserved the central image was. The children's faces were sharp and detailed. She could see the texture of William's wool jacket and the delicate lace on Eleanor's collar. But as the high-resolution scan appeared on her monitor, something caught her eye. There was an irregularity in the painted backdrop right between two of the painted trees. At first, she thought it was a water stain or perhaps damage to the original glass plate negative. She zoomed in closer, adjusting the contrast to see better. That's when her blood ran cold. It wasn't damage. It was a figure. Standing among the painted trees was something that shouldn't have been there. The figure was impossibly tall and thin, with arms that seemed too long for its body. Its limbs bent at strange angles as if it had been poorly assembled from mismatched parts. The thing's head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and where its face should have been, there was only a dark blur. It stood directly behind the children, looming over them like a twisted guardian. Alara's first instinct was to explain it away. Double exposures were common in early photography. Sometimes a glass plate would be used twice by accident, creating ghostly overlapping images. But the more she studied the figure, the less sense that explanation made. The edges were too defined, too deliberate. This wasn't an accident. The figure had been there when the photograph was taken. She checked the back of the photograph for any information. Written in fading brown ink were the words William and Eleanor Milton, Winter 1888, Thorne Studios. Below that, in different handwriting, someone had added, "May they rest in peace." That phrase made Alara pause. It was unusual to write such a thing on a children's portrait unless something had happened to them. She opened her laptop and began searching for information about the Milton family of Millbrook. What she found made the photograph even more disturbing. According to the town records, William and Eleanor Milton had died in a house fire on October 15, 1888. The fire had destroyed the family home completely, killing both children and severely injuring their parents. The cause was listed as an overturned lantern in the children's bedroom. It was a tragedy, but not uncommon for the time. House fires were a constant danger in the age of oil lamps and wood stoves. But something didn't add up. The photograph was dated winter 1888, which would mean it was taken in December or January. That was at least 2 months after the children had died. How could they have posed for a photograph after their death? Alara dug deeper into the archives. She found the original newspaper report about the fire in the Millbrook Gazette. The article was brief, only a few paragraphs, and focused mainly on the danger of lamp fires. But through her connections at the Historical Society, she managed to locate the journalist's original draft of the article. This version was much longer and contained details that had been removed from the published version. The draft mentioned that the Milton parents, James and Margaret, had become increasingly reclusive in the weeks before the fire. Neighbors reported that the family had stopped attending church and refused all visitors. The few people who had spoken to them said the parents seemed frightened and claimed their house was occupied by shadows. Margaret Milton had told one neighbor that something was watching the children, and that it moved through the walls like smoke. These details had been cut from the final article, likely because they made the family sound insane. But Alara couldn't ignore them, especially not with that figure lurking in the photograph. She needed to know more about the photographer. Elias Thorne had operated a small studio in Millbrook from 1885 to 1891. Finding information about him proved difficult, but eventually Alara located his personal effects in a museum collection 2 states away. Among them was his journal from 1888. The entries from October and November were normal, mostly complaints about the weather and notes about appointments. But the entry for December 3rd, 1888, was different. The handwriting was shaky, and the ink was smudged in places as if Thorne had been sweating while he wrote. "The Miltons came to me today with an impossible request," the entry began. "They carried with them a glass plate negative wrapped in black cloth. They claimed it contained an image of their children, though I know the children died 2 months ago. They begged me to develop it, to create just one print. They offered me 3 times my usual fee." The next part of the entry was almost illegible, but Alara could make out enough to understand what had happened. "I should have refused. When I placed the negative in the chemical bath, something was wrong. The image that appeared was not natural. The children were there, yes, but so was something else. A third presence that seemed to writhe in the developer, fighting against the chemicals. It was as if it was trying to remain hidden, but the process was forcing it to reveal itself." Thorne went on to describe the figure in detail. "It stands behind them like a scarecrow made of shadow and bone. Its arms could wrap around them twice. I felt it watching me from within the photograph, and the temperature in my darkroom dropped so suddenly that my breath came out in clouds. I made one print as requested and sealed away the negative. I will never touch it again." The journal entries after that day became increasingly paranoid. Thorne wrote about seeing tall shadows in his studio and feeling watched whenever he worked in his darkroom. He closed his business 3 months later and left Millbrook. His final entry simply read, "It follows the image." Alara knew she needed to find out what had really happened to the Milton family. The fire might have been the end, but it wasn't the beginning. She returned to the archives and searched through everything related to the Miltons. Most of it was standard documentation like property records and birth certificates, but then, filed incorrectly under the name Wilson instead of Milton, she found a sealed envelope. Inside was a letter from Margaret Milton to her sister, dated October 15, 1888, the day of the fire. The letter was water-stained and partially burned at the edges, but most of it was still readable. As Alara read it, the truth about the photograph finally became clear. "Dearest Catherine," the letter began, "by the time you receive this, we will be gone. I must tell someone the truth about what happened to our beautiful children and what we have tried to do to save their souls." Margaret went on to explain that the terror had started 3 months earlier. "It began with glimpses in the corner of our eyes, a tall figure that would disappear when we turned to look. James thought it was our imagination, stress from the harvest season, but then the children began to see it too. William called it the hinterman, because it was always behind things, never in front. The entity, whatever it was, had focused on the children. It would stand in their doorway at night, just watching. Eleanor stopped sleeping. William became pale and weak. We tried everything. We moved their beds, blessed the house, even had the pastor come to pray. Nothing worked. The thing just got bolder. The children had fallen ill with what the local doctor called a wasting sickness. They grew thinner and weaker despite eating normally. They died in their sleep on the same night, Margaret wrote, peaceful at last, but empty, as if something had drained them from the inside. But the parents hadn't accepted their children's death. We heard of an old belief from James's grandmother. She said that certain entities could be trapped in silver, that a photograph taken on a silver plate could imprison a spirit. We were desperate. We had to try something. They had somehow created a glass plate negative with the image of their children and the entity that had killed them. We thought if we could trap it in the photograph, we could seal it away forever. The photographer, poor Mr. Thorne, had no idea what we were asking him to do. But it worked, partially. The thing appeared in the image, caught like a fly in amber. But the ritual had gone wrong. The children did not return to us as we hoped, and the entity, though trapped, is not destroyed. It rages within the image, growing stronger. We can feel it trying to escape. We have no choice now but to burn everything. The negative, the print, the house, if necessary. We will not let this thing loose upon the world again. The letter ended with a warning. If any trace of the photograph survives, do not seek it out, do not develop it, do not look too closely. Some things are meant to remain hidden. Alara sat back from the letter, her hands shaking. The photograph on her screen seemed different now. The figure in the background appeared clearer, more defined. She could almost make out features in its dark face. And was it her imagination, or had it moved slightly closer to the children? She began to notice things in her own lab. Her reflection in the monitor sometimes showed a second shadow behind her chair. The temperature would drop suddenly, causing her breath to fog. Once, she was certain she saw something tall and thin reflected in the glass of a framed photo on her wall, but when she turned, nothing was there. The digitization process had done something. By converting the image to pixels, by enhancing and analyzing it, she had somehow weakened whatever seal the Miltons had created. The entity wasn't free, not yet, but it was testing the boundaries of its prison. Alara made a decision. She locked the original photograph in a lead-lined archive box, the kind used for storing radioactive materials. The digital files were encrypted and stored on a drive that she then placed in a safety deposit box. She wrote a detailed report about the photograph's history but recommended that it never be displayed or studied further. But she knew it was too late. Once something exists in digital form, it can never truly be destroyed. Copies could exist on backup drives, in email attachments, in places she didn't even know about. The Milton family had sacrificed everything to trap this entity in a single physical photograph. Now, in our age of infinite reproduction, that prison had developed cracks. The photograph of William and Eleanor Milton remains locked away in an undisclosed location. Officially, it's listed as too damaged for public display. But those who have seen it, who have looked closely at that tall figure hiding in the painted trees, report the same thing. They feel watched. They see shadows where shadows shouldn't be. And sometimes late at night they hear what sounds like old camera shutters clicking in empty rooms. The Milton family's sacrifice had bought humanity over a century of peace. They had trapped something that should never have existed in our world. But in our eagerness to preserve and digitize the past, we may have undone their work. The entity they called the Hinterman is still there, still watching from behind those painted trees. It's waiting for the moment when someone looks too long, enhances too much, and finally sets it free. Some photographs capture memories, others capture moments. But the photograph of William and Eleanor Milton captured something else entirely. It captured a predator, frozen in silver and chemicals, trapped between the living and the dead. Every time we look at it, we risk weakening the prison that holds it. The real tragedy isn't just what happened to the Milton children. It's that their parents' desperate attempt to save others from the same fate may have only delayed the inevitable. In trying to preserve history, we might have doomed our future. The Hinterman is patient. It has waited over a century, and thanks to modern technology, it might not have to wait much longer. If you enjoyed this look into a piece of haunted history, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories hidden in the archives. What do you think is trapped inside the photograph? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.